Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. And today the Irish are going to take over this program because we are going to talk about a new novel by Frank Delaney. The novel is called Tipperary. It's published by Random House. And Frank, thanks for stopping by again.
A pleasure.
The publisher, in his or her wisdom sheets, that they send along, here's what you should do. Maybe they say, talk about his other books first. Well, I thought to myself, the only other book of yours that I'm familiar with is Simple Courage, a true story of peril at sea.
We had a long conversation about it,
didn't we? And that is one of the most powerful stories I have ever read, and it's unforgettable. It's such a story of courage and honesty, that it just never leaves you.
It was about a sea captain who just wanted to do his duty. Captain Kurt Carlson. He was 37 years old. His ship, the Flying Enterprise, was hit on 2 successive days by 2 rogue waves. He had no lifeboats. He had 10 passengers, some of them elderly, some of them children, and 40 crew, and he had to get them off. I have a saying about him, Jim.
Okay.
Which is that I think he has a claim to be considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, American heroes of the 20th century.
I'll buy it.
He didn't want to do that. He didn't want to do it because he was a hero.
After it was over, he hid himself in some nowhere town in New Jersey.
Woodbridge, New Jersey.
Yeah, and wouldn't come out.
Wouldn't talk to anybody. The Ed Sullivan Show called him and said, we want you to appear on Sunday night. He said, no way. The following day, Buick called him and said, we're the sponsors of the Ed Sullivan Show, Captain Carlson, and if you appear on the Ed Sullivan Show next Sunday night, you're the most famous man in the world at the moment. You and your wife and 2 daughters will appear. We will give you a Buick. Carlson said, I can buy my own damn car, thank you. And he slammed the phone down, put on his hat. His daughter told me she was there at the time. Walked into Woodbridge, New Jersey, bought an Oldsmobile, and drove Oldsmobile for the rest of his life. That's my kind of guy.
He is your kind of guy. Now, Tipperary is also your kind of book in the sense that, A, it's about Ireland, B, it's big,
That's right.
and C, it doesn't stint on storylines. There are many of them in this book. And I feel the way to approach this book is to think of ourselves going into an Irish pub, and it's storytelling night. Very long night of storytelling, because this is a big story. And it begins the story in the late 19th century and ends actually in the mid-19th century and ends in the 1920s. So we can't stop the storytelling. We have to just go at it piece by piece. Where to begin? Well, if you're in a pub, any place is okay. So I'll start with saying that at one level, this book is about land.
Uh-huh.
Land, especially as it is perceived in Ireland. Is that true?
It's the hunger for land.
Yes.
It's the desire to have such control over your own life that you can produce your own food. That's what land is about for the Irish. I suppose it's like that for everybody. For some people, it's property development. But in Ireland, it's about cultivation. It's about feeding your family off your own property and therefore being beholden to no man. Independent.
Charles O'Brien, who's the main character in the book, has an early experience which brought home to him something he never forgot. He never forgot this experience, and it led to his love and devotion for the land. He accompanied his father, and they saw the ousting of a tenant family from their land and property. He writes, I found the great battering ram of that eviction I witnessed so deeply upsetting. Much more than the whipping of their bodies and faces, I felt a pain in my soul for those people losing their land. And it's the battering ram to knock down the house. That's what got to him, even though at the same time the people there were being whipped.
This is why I like talking to you. This is maybe my 25th, 26th conversation about this book, and you're the only person who has picked up the motive point of the book, which is the eviction. Now, the reason that scene is in there, Jim, is this. When I was a small boy, the greatest fear, locally, my mother's greatest fear, we were a comfortably off, upper middle class family in Ireland, well-to-do. We were the only people in the parish with a car, bought a car. The greatest fear was not of poverty or of hunger, but it was of eviction. Why? Because eviction of the kind described in that book was part of our folk memory. My great-grandfather was evicted like that. From a house like that, in that location. And many, many years later, when I went to work in London, my first assistant in London was the great-great-granddaughter of the man who did that eviction.
Tipperary is a book about land, and it's a book about many other things. It's also a haunting love story. Very different kind of love story, as we'll find out when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Tipperary, it's the title. Tipperary is a novel by Frank Delaney, published by Random House, Publishers Weekly, in part, had this to say about it. Delaney's confident storytelling. Well, damn right, you're a confident storyteller. And quirky characterizations, I don't know about quirky, enrich a fascinating and complex period of Irish history. And you give us the whole thing. But all of that history is based on what we talked about in the first segment. It's based on land. Who can have it, who can own it, who can live there and do what he or she wants to do with it. So it's all tied into that. Now, one of the things that happens, as we might find out, we're back in the pub, about 100 or so pages in, maybe more, maybe less, is that there are two narrators to this story. One, of course, is Charles, and the other is
Michael Nugent, who finds Charles O'Brien's handwritten history in an old trunk and begins to interpret it for us. And as the story proceeds, and he observes Charles O'Brien's history and checks the historical facts and tells us more about the history Charles O'Brien is writing about and the characters and the people involved, and goes on to expand the commentary, we suddenly begin to realize that there's more to this than meets the eye, because Nugent chillingly recognizes that he has a deeper, unknown connection to Charles O'Brien that he could ever have imagined.
Which connection, folks, is not really shown and solved until the very last pages of the book, and we're not going to talk about it now.
We are not.
What we are going to talk about is the love affair. As I read it, I kept saying to myself, what a strange love affair. Charles is crazily in love with April Burke. And her reaction to him is to call him names and suggest that he get as far away from her as he possibly can. The thing that was hard to grasp at first, but I think after I got into it more, I understood it, is why he continued the pursuit.
He's 40 when he meets her. She's 18. He's Irish and tempestuously passionate. She's English and cool and distant. And he's unable to resist her. He's never had a love affair. He's unable to resist her. Neither is he able to express it in a way that clinches his heart's grip on her heart. He has to find other ways of doing it. And that is why he writes a history of himself and his country and his time. Why does he fall in love with her? It's the what-if ingredient that's in all the books we enjoy. What if you saw somebody today walking out of this building and you fell irretrievably, irrevocably, compulsively in love with that person and couldn't shake it?
She calls him at one point, you lout, you scandal. Leave this house now. This is when he's in her father's house in London. And shortly thereafter, he has an internal colloquy. I had money in the bank. I did not frighten children, offend ladies, or cause distress to clergymen. Nice guy. Even now, I remained as diligent to my parents as when I had wanted to please them eagerly as any small child. My knowledge of diverse and useful matters was wide and copious. And he was also a healer.
A traveling herbalist who
Yes.
wanted to cure his own people of their ills.
What an admirable fellow.
He's a nice guy. It's more difficult to write about a good man than about a villain.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And that was the challenge.
Yeah, yeah. But I think you succeeded. The other thing that Charles is smitten with is Tipperary Castle, whence comes the title. Is this an actual building? Can I go see it? The ruins of it, perhaps?
The ruins are there. It's based on an actual building that was so lavish and so magnificent. It was 3/4 of a mile from my home. It filled my eyes the moment I woke up every morning, last thing when I went to bed at night under the moonlight. You would imagine there was a banquet taking place. You would fancy you heard the strains of the music coming down across the fields. It was so lavish, Jim, that when my father came to that parish in 1914 for the first time, there were 220 gardeners working in this castle.
Oh, my gosh.
It was magnificent. It was like one of the great chateaux of the Loire or one of the great castles of Scotland.
He's in love with it, and she's in love with it, eventually. And the relation that they have for most of the story is through the castle,
You get it.
through the rebuilding of it.
You get it completely.
And I kept shaking my head. But the more I shook my head, something came loose, and it dawned on me that, again, we're dealing with this powerful, powerful thing called land, property, and the right thereunto.
And it's a language between them. And it's a language of love between them.
Well, Tipperary teems with other interesting characters, some of whom you've heard of, others are brand new. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. It is Conversations on the Coast. The title today, a great novel by Frank Delaney called Tipperary, brought to you by your friends at Random House, about which Library Journal said in part in a starred review. That's very important, Frank. With this follow-up to his acclaimed, I hate this, with his acclaimed follow-up to his acclaimed Ireland. I didn't read Ireland, but I love this book. Delaney has crafted another meticulously researched journey through his homeland. The focus this time is on Castle Tipperary, one of the grand houses of the Anglo-Irish. Its story is told through the love of Charles O'Brien, an itinerant healer, for April Burke, the only child of a noble Irish family. The struggles of Delaney's characters for survival mirror the history of Ireland during the colonial years from 1860 to 1922. It's a tale told many times, yet Delaney's careful scholarship and compelling storytelling bring it uniquely alive. And then they say, this is very big in Library Journal. Highly recommended. I mean, you can take that to the bank. I'll tell you right now.
I will.
Before we get into characters, the way you bring in historic detail, there's a richness to it. For example, you talk about the black and tan, and now for the first time I understand why they're called black and tan. What's the story about that?
The Black and Tans were the army that the English sent in to cope with the IRA during the Irish War of Independence from 1919 to 1921. They weren't an army at all. They weren't even soldiers. They were a kind of police reserve, most of whom were convicted criminals in English jails, serving
and also nice guys like rapists.
Oh, yes, serving sentences for statutory rape, for robbery with violence, for armed robbery, and for murder. And they were paroled on condition they went to Ireland to fight the IRA. They had no uniforms for them. So they gave them the black tunics of the police and the tan breeches of the army. And that's how they became known as Black and
Black and
Tans.
Tan.
They were feared and hated. When I was growing up, Jim, in Tipperary town, there was a man there whose father was a Black and Tan. And that man, 40 years afterwards, was a social outcast.
Oh, my gosh.
People wouldn't speak to him.
Oh, my gosh.
Would point to him. See him, his father was a Tan.
One of the other historic details that I found fascinating, because I don't think I ever heard it before. If I had heard it, I've forgotten it, that during World War I, the Brits made a promise to the Irish that if a man would go and fight for the Brits over in France, mainly during World War I, that he would become a landowner when he got back.
Not only that, but they promised that Ireland would get what they called home rule, self-government, no longer be ruled from London if Irishmen volunteered to join the British Army during the Great War.
Thousands of them did.
Proportionately speaking, in proportion to the size of the general population, more Irishmen died in the Great War than Brits.
Oh, my gosh.
And they died in their hundreds of thousands. 227,000 Irishmen died in the Great War.
Wow.
One, I think, for every 15 of the population. I know villages in Ireland where there were no menfolk because they had all died in the Great War.
They'd all died.
In fact, I know at one stage when I was growing up, I remember asking my mother, we didn't know one family who didn't have a relative died in the Great War.
Let's look at some of these historic folks that you introduce us to in your own way. The first one, I think, at least on my chart, is Charles Stewart Parnell,
The
Ireland's
lost
hero.
leader.
Remember
The lost leader.
the
The uncrowned King of Ireland. Here's the point. Here's the point.
Okay.
Supposing that you are the hero of a novel somebody writes in 100 years' time, think of the people you've met. This book is littered with people that Charles O'Brien met. I met hundreds, if not thousands, of very distinguished people because I was interviewing them. He was doing the same. Plus, he was going to their houses as a doctor, as a paramedic, trying to cure people. And in Ireland, everybody meets everybody else. I have a friend who went to college in Arkansas around the time Bill Clinton was there. And I said to her one day, did you know Bill Clinton when you went to college in Arkansas? She said, honey, everyone who went to college in Arkansas knew Bill Clinton. It was like that in Ireland. Everybody in Ireland knows everybody else.
Oh. Now, one of the main characters here, Joseph Patrick Harney, is he real or
Totally fictional.
Totally, okay.
Totally fictional.
I'm glad to hear that because that's what I thought.
A freedom fighter who tells his own story to the Irish Folklore Commission. So there is a record of his place in the War of Independence. And he is Charles O'Brien's closest and dearest friend. And is, of course, in fact, secretly in love with April Burke, the woman Charles O'Brien loves. But he's a useful narrator because he's really the one. He's a soldier. He's a freedom fighter. He's a hard, cold, practical man when he's being a soldier. And from him, you get the most accurate picture of your hero.
It's time to leave the Irish pub. You can get the book and continue the conversation. Don't forget, it's called Tipperary. Don't forget, it's by Frank Delaney, and this has been Conversations on the Coast.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.